While 1967 gave us cinematic masterpieces like The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, and Cool Hand Luke, it also witnessed some of Hollywood's most spectacular financial disasters. The film industry was undergoing massive changes, the studio system was crumbling, audience tastes were shifting, and production costs were skyrocketing. This perfect storm created the conditions for unprecedented box office catastrophes that sent studios into panic mode and nearly ended several high-profile careers. Even legendary directors and A-list stars weren't immune to the financial bloodbath that defined this pivotal year in cinema history. Behind the glamorous premieres and star-studded red carpets lurked financial nightmares that Hollywood executives still whisper about today. These weren't just minor disappointments. They were career killers, studio busters, and budget destroyers that left lasting scars on the industry. From forgotten art house experiments to bloated musical spectacles, 1967's box office bombs represent a fascinating chapter in film history that reveals as much about Hollywood's hubris as it does about changing cultural tastes. Let's journey through the cinematic wreckage of 1967, starting with the films that have virtually vanished from our collective memory despite featuring respected talent and significant financial backing. Few remember Sailor from Gibraltar, a film that hemorrhaged money for United Artists while torpedoing the momentum of its acclaimed director. Tony Richardson had recently won an Oscar for Tom Jones, making him one of the industry's hottest directors. Yet, this experimental drama starring Jean Moreau as a wealthy woman searching for her lost lover cost United Artists a staggering $1.17 million loss, equivalent to over $10 million today. The film's meandering plot and pretentious art house styling alienated audiences seeking more accessible entertainment. Critics savaged its self-indulgent approach, with one famously writing it was like watching paint dry if the paint were mixed with sleeping pills. Behind the scenes, Richardson's volatile relationship with studio executives created a toxic production environment. When the film tanked, United Artists shelved plans for 2 additional Richardson projects. Even more disturbing were rumors of extravagant waste during filming, with production reportedly halting whenever Richardson became dissatisfied with minor details, running up costs daily. The film's commercial failure marked the beginning of Richardson's decline in Hollywood, proving that even Oscar winners weren't immune to box office poison. Lightning struck twice when Richardson and Moreau collaborated again the same year on Mademoiselle, another financial disaster that lost approximately $1 million. This dark tale of a sociopathic school teacher who secretly commits acts of vandalism while maintaining a respectable facade was too bleak and disturbing for mainstream audiences. The uncomfortable, intimate themes and moral ambiguity might find appreciation in today's cinema landscape, but in 1967, they spelled box office death. Production issues plagued Mademoiselle from the start. Filming in rural France, Richardson reportedly clashed with locals who were disturbed by the story's content. Moreau's performance, while critically admired, was deemed too cold and unsympathetic for audiences to connect with. United Artists' marketing department struggled to promote a film where the protagonist was essentially a villain, eventually releasing it with minimal publicity after disastrous test screenings. The consecutive failures of Sailor from Gibraltar and Mademoiselle didn't just cost the studio millions, they effectively ended Richardson's reign as an A-list Hollywood director, demonstrating how quickly fortunes could change in the volatile film industry of the 1960s. The critical darling Harold Pinter saw his theatrical success fail to translate to cinema with The Birthday Party. Despite featuring acclaimed actors like Robert Shaw and Patrick Magee, this adaptation of Pinter's celebrated absurdist play confused and alienated moviegoers. The story's deliberate ambiguity and threatening atmosphere may have worked brilliantly on stage, but cinema audiences expecting clearer narratives rejected it outright. Its abstract examination of identity and authority through the story of a man terrorized by mysterious strangers in a seaside boarding house was intellectual catnip for critics but poison for the box office. Director William Friedkin, who would later create blockbusters like The Exorcist, couldn't solve the fundamental problem of making Pinter's dialogue-heavy, meaning-light play visually engaging. The film's failure taught Friedkin valuable lessons about audience expectations that he would apply to later successes. The Birthday Party has since gained appreciation in academic circles, but its initial failure sent a clear message about the risks of bringing experimental theater to mainstream cinema. The disappointment hit particularly hard because investors had been banking on Pinter's literary reputation to drive ticket sales, proving that critical acclaim doesn't always translate to commercial viability. The musical genre's decline accelerated with Half a Sixpence, a British production starring Tommy Steele that failed to recapture the magic of his stage success. This adaptation of the popular West End and Broadway show about an orphan who inherits a fortune felt dated and quaint in the era of counterculture and social upheaval. Paramount Pictures, hoping to replicate the success of My Fair Lady, instead found themselves with an expensive albatross that audiences largely ignored. Tommy Steele, while a major star in Britain, couldn't attract American audiences unfamiliar with his theatrical work. The film's old-fashioned sensibilities and traditional approach to the musical format seemed out of step with the revolutionary spirit of 1967. One executive reportedly muttered after the premiere, "We've made a film for an audience that no longer exists." Production had been troubled from the beginning, with director George Sidney struggling to adapt the theatrical staging to cinema's more intimate medium. The elaborate musical numbers, which had dazzled live audiences, appeared excessive and artificial on screen. The film's failure contributed to Hollywood's growing skepticism about big-budget musicals, setting the stage for even bigger disasters to come. When Anthony Quinn agreed to star in The Happening, he was coming off career-defining roles in Zorba the Greek and Lawrence of Arabia. His clout couldn't save this bizarre counterculture comedy about hippies who kidnap a retired mafia kingpin. The film's attempt to capitalize on youth culture while featuring a 52-year-old Quinn as the lead created a fundamental disconnect that audiences couldn't overlook. Variety magazine listed it among the year's biggest duds, noting its confused tone and meandering storyline. The production suffered from a severe case of establishment filmmakers trying to capture the youth zeitgeist without understanding it. Director Elliot Silverstein, fresh off the success of Cat Ballou, reportedly clashed with younger cast members over interpretations of the counterculture movement. The studio's marketing campaign only worsened matters, promoting it as a wacky comedy while the film itself contained darker, more satirical elements about generational divides. Even the involvement of rising star Faye Dunaway in one of her first roles couldn't generate sufficient interest. When the film bombed, Quinn reportedly blamed the failure on the studio's misguided attempt to make me play someone 30 years younger, though insiders suggest his difficult on-set behavior contributed to the production's problems. Otto Preminger, once considered among Hollywood's most reliable directors, found his reputation severely damaged by Hurry Sundown, a Southern melodrama plagued by production problems and controversy. Starring Michael Caine and Jane Fonda, this tale of racial tensions and land disputes in Georgia was criticized for its stereotypical portrayals and heavy-handed messaging. Production difficulties began immediately when local Georgia residents protested the film's content, forcing much of the shooting to relocate to Louisiana. The troubled shoot included reports of Preminger's tyrannical behavior toward cast and crew, with multiple actors allegedly walking off set. Jane Fonda later described the experience as one of the most miserable of my career. The film's approach to racial issues was considered patronizing even by 1967 standards, with African-American characters portrayed as one-dimensional saints or victims. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, publicly criticized the film, further damaging its commercial prospects. When Hurry Sundown flopped, Paramount Pictures executives were reportedly furious about the wasted investment on what was intended to be a prestigious social drama. The failure accelerated Preminger's career decline and served as a cautionary tale about approaching sensitive social issues without authentic understanding or nuance. Star power alone couldn't save The Way West, an epic Western featuring Kirk Douglas, Robert Mitchum, and Richard Widmark. This adaptation of A.B. Guthrie Jr.'s Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about pioneers on the Oregon Trail should have been a guaranteed success with such legendary actors. Instead, it became one of United Artists' most disappointing releases of the year. The film's plotting pace and lack of the action sequences audiences expected from Westerns resulted in empty theaters and harsh reviews. Behind the scenes, the production was allegedly marred by ego clashes among its three male leads, with each demanding more screen time and better lines. Director Andrew V. McLaglen struggled to manage the competing star personalities while dealing with the logistical challenges of location shooting in Oregon and Arizona. The film's massive budget, spent primarily on the stars' salaries and authentic period detail, couldn't be recouped as audiences showed declining interest in traditional Westerns. Industry insiders point to The Way West as an example of how dramatically audience tastes were shifting in the late 1960s, as the classic Western formula that had reliably delivered profits for decades suddenly felt stale and outdated. Frank Sinatra's star was still bright in 1967, but his detective film Tony Rome proved that even Old Blue Eyes couldn't guarantee box office success. This neo-noir about a private investigator investigating a wealthy family's secrets was Sinatra's attempt to create a new franchise character. Despite his popularity and a supporting cast including Jill St. John and Gina Rowlands, the film registered a financial loss that surprised 20th Century Fox executives who had considered it a safe bet. The production itself was relatively smooth, with Sinatra reportedly engaged and professional throughout, contrary to his reputation for disinterest on some film sets. The problem lay more with the film's derivative nature, as critics noted similarities to more successful detective films and television shows. Audiences seemingly had little interest in watching Sinatra play a hard-boiled detective when they could see him perform concerts or watch his earlier, more distinctive work. While not as catastrophic as some other entries on this list, Tony Rome underperformed enough to raise questions about Sinatra's continuing viability as a leading man. Ironically, despite the financial disappointment, Fox proceeded with a sequel the following year, Lady in Cement, which performed even worse, effectively ending Sinatra's leading man status in Hollywood. Warner Brothers had massive expectations for Camelot, their lavish Arthurian musical starring Richard Harris and Vanessa Redgrave. The studio had committed a staggering $17 million, equivalent to well over $130 million today, to this adaptation of the Broadway hit. What they got instead was a bloated 3-hour film that critics found ponderous and audiences largely avoided. The film's troubled production included director Joshua Logan's battles with the studio over the film's length, with executives reportedly begging him to cut at least 40 minutes from the runtime. Richard Harris, though brilliant in the role of King Arthur, was notoriously difficult during production, demanding script changes and allegedly appearing intoxicated on set. Vanessa Redgrave, while perfect as Guinevere, was reportedly distracted by her political activism, causing scheduling conflicts. The film's extravagant sets and costumes, which did win Academy Awards, drove the budget to unsustainable levels. When Camelot failed to recoup its massive investment, it contributed to Warner Brothers' financial crisis and eventually led to Jack Warner's departure from the studio he had co-founded. Industry insiders claim the Camelot disaster forced Warner Brothers to greenlight the much smaller, less expensive Bonnie and Clyde out of financial necessity, ironically resulting in one of the year's biggest hits and most influential films. Julie Andrews had become a box office guarantee following Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, but thoroughly modern Millie proved even her star power had limits. This 1920s set musical comedy about a small-town girl seeking adventure in New York City cost Universal Pictures considerably more than it earned back. The elaborate production design, period costumes, and massive musical numbers drove the budget well beyond initial projections, making profitability nearly impossible despite decent ticket sales. Andrews delivered her usual excellent performance, but the film's convoluted plot involving human trafficking rings and identity theft confused audiences expecting something more straightforward. Director George Roy Hill, who would later make classics like Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid, reportedly clashed with producers over the film's tone, wanting to emphasize the darker elements, while the studio pushed for a lighter touch similar to Andrews' previous successes. Test screenings went poorly, leading to extensive re-editing that failed to solve the fundamental tonal issues. Interestingly, while initially considered a financial disappointment, thoroughly modern Millie has developed a cult following over the decades, with modern audiences appreciating its camp elements and Andrews' performance far more than 1967 viewers did. Charlie Chaplin's final directorial effort, A Countess from Hong Kong, should have been a triumphant capstone to an unparalleled career. Instead, this romantic comedy starring Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren became both a critical and commercial disaster that tarnished Chaplin's legacy. The story of a diplomat who falls for a Russian countess working as a companion was oddly old-fashioned and out of touch with contemporary sensibilities. Universal Pictures had invested heavily in what they expected to be a prestigious production, only to watch it become one of the year's most notorious disappointments. The troubled production was dominated by reports of Chaplin's authoritarian directing style, which alienated both Brando and Loren. Brando later called working with Chaplin the most unpleasant experience I've ever had on a film set. Chaplin, then 77 years old, insisted on demonstrating every movement and line reading for his actors, a method that had worked with less established performers but infuriated stars of Brando and Lauren's caliber. The film's old-fashioned visual style and pacing felt anachronistic in the rapidly evolving cinematic landscape of 1967. Critics were particularly harsh, with the New York Times calling it sadly disappointing and noting the total absence of the old Chaplin magic. The film's failure effectively ended Chaplin's filmmaking career and served as a painful reminder that even the greatest cinema pioneers could lose touch with evolving audience tastes. The volatile romance between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton had generated enormous box office through films like Cleopatra and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Their star power couldn't prevent The Taming of the Shrew from underperforming financially, however. This adaptation of Shakespeare's controversial comedy about gender roles consumed an enormous budget on opulent sets and costumes, with Taylor's contract allegedly including a clause for a percentage of profits that never materialized. Director Franco Zeffirelli created a visually stunning film, but production was reportedly chaotic due to the star's famous off-screen volatility. Burton and Taylor's relationship was in one of its turbulent phases during filming, with their personal conflicts sometimes spilling onto the set. While critics generally praised the performances, particularly Taylor's spirited Catherine, audiences in 1967 showed limited interest in Shakespearean adaptations, regardless of the stars involved. Columbia Pictures executives were reportedly shocked by the weak box office returns, having considered the Burton-Taylor pairing financial insurance. The film's disappointing performance indicated that even the most bankable stars had limitations when it came to attracting audiences to challenging material, a lesson Hollywood continues to relearn regularly. Perhaps the most fascinating box office story of 1967 belongs to Valley of the Dolls. This adaptation of Jacqueline Suzanne's best-selling novel about three women navigating show business while battling addiction was savaged by critics but has since achieved cult classic status. The film's sensationalistic approach to topics like substance abuse, relationships, and mental illness shocked contemporary audiences and critics, with one reviewer calling it a dirty soap opera from start to finish. Despite the negative reviews, curiosity about the controversial content drove some initial ticket sales, though not enough to make it a true financial success given its production costs. The troubled production became legendary, with director Mark Robson reportedly clashing with almost everyone involved. Star Judy Garland was fired during filming, later replaced by Susan Hayward, while Patty Duke, Sharon Tate, and Barbara Parkins struggled with the melodramatic material. Jacqueline Suzanne herself hated the adaptation of her novel so much that she publicly criticized it. The film's failure damaged the careers of several involved, particularly Patty Duke, who found her transition from child star to adult roles severely hampered. Ironically, Valley of the Dolls has found redemption through subsequent generations of viewers who appreciate its camp value and over-the-top performances. It has become one of the most beloved, so bad it's good films in cinema history, regularly screening at midnight movie festivals and inspiring countless tribute performances. The collective box office carnage of these 13 films sent shockwaves through Hollywood that would fundamentally change the industry. Studio executives, panicked by mounting losses, began pivoting towards smaller, youth-oriented productions that could connect with changing audience tastes. The success of low-budget films like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate that same year stood in stark contrast to these expensive failures, signaling a dramatic shift in filmmaking approaches. The financial disasters of 1967 also accelerated the collapse of the old studio system, as companies weakened by these losses became acquisition targets for larger conglomerates with no filmmaking experience. Careers were derailed, studio heads were fired, and an entire filmmaking era began drawing to a close. Yet, from this creative destruction emerged the groundbreaking New Hollywood movement of the 1970s, with young directors like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, and Steven Spielberg revolutionizing American cinema. What's particularly fascinating about these box office disasters is how many have found redemption over time. Films once dismissed as failures have been reassessed by new generations of viewers unburdened by original expectations. Thoroughly modern Millie and Valley of the Dolls have developed dedicated cult followings, while even critical disasters like A Countess from Hong Kong have found defenders who appreciate their unique qualities. The initial financial failure of these films tells only part of their story, as cinema history continues to rewrite their legacies. These 13 box office disasters of 1967 remind us that in Hollywood, Financial success and artistic merit often exist on entirely separate planes. They represent bold artistic swings, misguided commercial calculations, and the fascinating intersection of art and commerce that defines the film industry. Their failures changed Hollywood forever, and perhaps taught lessons that today's filmmakers should remember as they navigate their own high-stakes cinematic gambles.